I'll never forget the day I read a book. It was contagious, 70 pages. There were pictures here and there, so it wasn't hard to bear. The day I read a book.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to February session of the Wafer-Thin Books reading group. This month, we are going to be looking at another sort of disturbing book. So we're gonna have a few uppers somewhere later in the year, but this right now is not a book that leaves one with pleasant images in the mind. In fact, I could see Buñuel directing this in a particularly disturbing fashion. So we're talking to this month about Willem Frederik Hermans' book, An Untouched House, this book was published first in the Netherlands in 1951 as part of a series of wafer-thin books, in fact, by a publisher known in Dutch as De Bezig Bee, which means the busy bee. And so there was actually, this would be interesting to find out what other books were in the series. It was a series targeted at first-time authors, sort of reviving and bringing back the Dutch literature market domestically after the war. And this was this book was considered quite controversial in the Netherlands when it came out, because there was still sort of this myth of the brave resistance against the brutal Nazis, as opposed to an honest recognition that there was a lot of collaboration going on. And if you've seen, I mean, later on, you can look at authors like Harry Mulisch, movies like Soldier of Orange, that were much more, open-eyed about the fact that, and to me, just to go off on a little soapbox here, but I think this is one of the reasons Americans don't tend to look at politics in a nuanced way, is that we have not lived through occupations where all sorts of moral trade-offs got made just to survive. And so it wasn't the good guys and the bad guys. It was a much more, it's a much messier picture. But before we get into talking about An Untouched House, let's talk a little bit. Tell us, James, for you to start off, what have you been reading? What other wafer thinners have you been reading this month?
Yes, a few. They've been a bit of a mixed bag. The best ones were, to start with this, which is Notes from an Island. It's a kind of a cobbled together book in some ways. It's diaries and notes and letters that Tove Jansson wrote. But it's quite an odd book because it's her and her partner, Tuulikki. I'm going to stuff this up because it's a Finnish name. Tuulikki Pietilä. And they basically just, they were out on one small island and it got too busy, so they went further and further out. So it's just a diary of the two of them and sometimes Tove's mother and occasionally her brother, just trying to build this little, not even quite a house, a little shack on a tiny little island out in the frozen water. And it's quite odd because it's, these two gay women and a bunch of kind of fairly rugged sailors who transport all the stuff out there and help them build it. And they all get on in a way that is, considering this was the 60s, in a way you would not have necessarily predicted as being a particularly smooth mixture of people. But it's just a really interesting vibe that she captures. And it's just fascinating to read. I mean, I'm a huge Tove Jansson fan. I grew up reading her children's books, and now, fortunately, most of her adult writing has been translated into English. I think this was one of the last things to be translated across. So there's that. And one of the other best things I read, which actually Gordon, who's here, gave me this, which was great of him because it's From Our Own Fire by William Letford. And yeah, fantastic. It's 100 pages. It's half prose, half poetry. And it's, yeah, sort of a near future Scottish novel about a Scottish family basically fleeing civilization when the singularity happens and people all start getting uplifted into the hive mind created by an artificial intelligence. But it's sort of written partly in English, partly in Scots. And yeah, it's just really clever, really interesting. And it made me seek out, there's another book called, I can't remember the author, but Bina Ben a Go-Go, which is apparently a completely Scots written sort of post-apocalyptic novel, which I've got on order. And I hope it will turn up soon, but I'm looking forward to that.
Was that Matthew Wynne or something?
Something like
Close.
that, yeah. But yeah, it seems to be out of print, I think, but this didn't seem to be too expensive, so I've got a copy coming because I have no impulse control. And then in terms of good but not great, I've been reading recently a lot of books by Gil Brewer, who's one of the sort of great pulp writers, and a lot of his stuff's been collected by Stark House Press. Unfortunately, this one, if you can see the spine, they've cocked up the title. They've put an extra E in darkness. But yeah, this is Flight to Darkness and 77 Rue Paradis, which are just, yeah, two more of his novels. He was one of those writers who was tremendously alcoholic. And so the quality control between books varies wildly. When he's on form, they're fantastic. But some of them, you can really see the rough edges showing when he was, getting more and more booze sodden. It's a bit like Bram Stoker, Dracula, he's at the peak. And then, the more the syphilis kicks in, the books get more and more rackety. And then two that were a bit of a mix as well. George Eliot's Janet's Repentance. It's one of the scenes from clerical life novellas that she wrote, which is good and entertaining, but it comes very early in her career, and it's a lumpy thing because it's the first 100 pages are all set up for what feels as though it's going to be a sort of 800-page Middlemarch style novel. Everyone in the town gets introduced, their backgrounds, their interactions, everything happens, and all of that builds up, and the story does not start. And then 100 pages in, it suddenly kicks off. Everything is resolved, another 50, 60 pages, and it ends. So it's structurally very weird.
Who's that from? What press is that from?
Oh, that's from Hesperus Press.
Oh my gosh! Does anybody know what the story is with Hesperus? Because they did wonderful, wonderful books, and I have a couple in my stack, and then they disappeared, and they came from a well-endowed patron, I think.
Yeah, the part of the problem is they started off and they just focused on short classics, and they were great. They put out probably a couple of hundred, and they were really good. And then I think there was some argument with the patron, and a whole lot of the creative people who were behind it went to Alma, who are now One World, I think. And then the people who are left started focusing on more commercial books, and they published that 100-Year-Old Man Who Went Out the Window book. And then there was some financial irregularities, shall we say, about paying out royalties, and they got in a lot of trouble. And I think though they still exist, I don't think they've published anything in years, but they still exist with the sort of bits of backlist that are left over. But yeah, so there were some problems there.
That's a shame because they were nicely it was a nicely curated list, and the books were so nicely packaged.
Yeah, well, a bit like Pushkin used to be before they sort of broadened their horizon. They published these really nice small, European mostly classics, and yes, since then they've kind of gone in every direction and just become another publisher of whatever they can get their hands on. But and the last one of short books that I read this is Happy Hour by Brooke McCorkle Okazaki. It's from the 33 1/3 series, which are just short books, each of which focuses on a album. Some of them are great, some of them are not so great. This is sort of in the middle. The main problem, it's about band Shonen Knife, who are a kind of, I guess, pop punk Japanese all-female band, who are a tremendously fun band. And this is not at all a fun book. It's sort of drowning in academic language to the point where it just sort of throttles your enjoyment. So it has some interesting stuff, but it's more like, it's very much a university publication with all the lack of joy that brings with it. So
That's
yeah,
a
so
huge
some
series too, isn't it? I mean, there's like over 100 titles in it now. I mean,
yes, and this
or
is from one of there's a bunch
phenomenal
of
number.
sub-series too. So this is from the Japanese sub-series. There's a European sub-series, now an Oceania series, which has a bunch of Australian and New Zealand albums. Annoyingly, the non-main series ones like this are a different shape and size to the other ones. So you put them all on the shelf and you look at them and go mad every time. But yeah. So they're the other small ones I've read, yeah, probably in the last month.
Okay. I want to just mention a couple that I've been posting things on Twitter just to kind of keep the interest, but in particular one that I've been picking up stuff kind of just because I open it up and start reading. And so one of them that I mentioned is this. This is an American writer who's, I suspect, is really not known at all in Australia or the UK, Wright Morris.
We have Morris Wright.
What?
We have Morris Wright, the writer.
Okay. Well, Wright Morris was born in Nebraska, but he left there early on. He has written a number of Nebraska set novels, and he's kind of like Willa Cather. He's still kind of got this burden of regionalism over his shoulder, although he's written really, I mean, he wrote a wide variety of books. But these two books are about, it's Fire Sermon and A Life. They are in, well, let me get them in camera. They are in print because a lady I'm writing a book about named Virginia Faulkner fell in love with Wright Morris's writing, and she was working for the University of Nebraska Press, which was one of the first presses, academic presses, to publish paperbacks, and they called it the Bison Book series. And it's been a huge success. There are hundreds and hundreds of Bison books out there now, but they particularly focused on bringing Western and Midwestern writers back into print. And so they set up a deal with Wright Morris starting in the late 60s, where pretty much after his his hardbacks came out and fell into the backlist, that the University of Nebraska Press picked up the contracts for the paperback rights. And so he's actually been well, because basically the vast majority of his oeuvre up until about the mid 70s is still in print today from the University of Nebraska Press as Bison books. So these two books are available. And it's basically about a guy is in his 80s who his sister, his one relative, dies in Nebraska, and he's been taking care of a young boy who has kind of been left because there's no one else in the family. And the two of them drive this 1928 old car with a trailer back to Nebraska, and it ends up that the house gets burnt up along with everything he's known in his family. And then finally he works his way back by himself to the ranch he had in many years ago in New Mexico, and it kind of was the close of his journey. But Morris is a very kind of spare, he's a bit Willa Cather-like in the sense that his prose is simple but deceiving in how much is under the surface. Unlike Cather, though, you will laugh out loud at points in the book, because Cather was not known for her sense of humor. So I would say if you're ever interested in just great human stories, write more, and wonderful prose, very spare, clean, evocative prose. Two other things I want to mention. This was recommended by Michael Orthofer. Well, I didn't include it because it's not a novel, and I'm not sure you can see, but this is called Sorry Meniscus by Iain Sinclair. And this is about the Millennial Dome in London, which is like, a symbol of many great, poorly thought out, poorly executed, completely disheartening ventures that British government seem to have bought into in a big way, really, since the end of World War II. They do this over and over and over again. And this is one of these things because it's way out in the docklands. And it was in a godforsaken place, a part of ground. And I mean, Sinclair just writes about places so well. And he's talking about walking up to the grounds where the dome was in the process of being built. It says, you smell the fumes, an unmannerly belch of black smoke, a brewery pall that hits you as soon as you emerge from the Blackwell Tunnel. Oasty, hot in the throat, disquieting, griddled bird shit. But in the throat, the world through a sepia filter, dust storms of gravy browning, iron fillings and a furious wind scrape the cornea, noise that you can taste, the thump of generators and jackhammers refusing to synchronize with your heartbeat, headache preambles, the torrid promise of Pete's savory products, yards decorated with Hascam drums in the same virulently on-message blue as the millennial hard hats. Greenwich Peninsula is the home of Amylum UK, glucose, starches, proteins, of the biphosphated guano company, manufacturers of, quote, artificial manure, of the Molassine Works, makers of animal foods, Vim's, all dogs love it, of Harrison Barber's Knackers Yards. Those lovely old Dobbins you notice out on the marshes are waiting for their turn at the stun gun. So it's just I mean, you can see him relishing this opportunity to just portray this, this grand, ambitious project in the absolute, least inspiring terms possible. So it's hilariously funny. And the last one I want to mention is I just picked it up because I was going through my stacks to look for, thin books, and I found this one. This is actually a paperback. I am positive I bought this probably in 1975 when I was 17, and it's called The Freelance Pallbearers by Ishmael Reed. Are any of you familiar with Ishmael Reed? He's a black novelist, hysterically funny writer, and he writes prose that's just so raw and full of jazz and I mean, it's this is probably technically not. It's 116 pages in a Bantam paperback, and I know this is original because it actually, in the bio in the back, it says he's working on his second novel. And I suspect he's probably got at least a dozen to 15 out the door by now. So, I mean, if you want to just, any of his books are great. The language is just, it's like fireworks.
I've only read Mumbo Jumbo, but that was brilliant. I bought that because any book with Josephine Baker on the cover is hard to pass up. But yeah, that was a fantastic book.
Yeah, Mumbo Jumbo's great. He has another one called, that's sort of a parody black Western called The Yellow Radio Broke Down, which is another great one. Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's written a bad book, to be honest, when it comes to his novels. Anybody else want to jump in? Because we do have a guest with us, a special guest this month. We have Josh Roth, who is a publisher of Sublunary Edition, which has put out quite a number of nice wafer-thin books on his own, and he's also the entrepreneur behind Asterism Books, which is the small independent press, his favorite distributor in the U.S. and God knows we've needed one because the rest of them are hideous nightmares so far. So I invited Josh to kind of come in and pitch some of the favorite wafer thinners that he's been involved with. So if everybody's happy, we're going to turn it over to Josh, and the mic is yours. You're on. No, we're not hearing you. Sorry.
Everyone. Yeah, thanks again, Brad. Appreciate you inviting me. Everyone now, like we're good. Thumbs up. Okay.
Oh.
Well, it's good to see a lot of familiar faces. So yeah, thanks for the invite. It's this is very much my bread and butter. What Wafer-Thin is kind of my shtick, if you will. Having kind of started out as a writer working in a very we'll say unmarketable length. So I wanted to share a few titles from the sublunary backlist that I think would be of interest to the group. So we publish a mixture of novellas, short stories, sort of small, otherwise unclassifiable books, as well as poetry, which are unclassifiable in their own way. And we cover a pretty wide swath of history from about 1510 till today. So I'm going to start with, actually, I'm going to start with two titles from the 1920s. So through our Empyrean series, Ivan Moscow by Boris Pilniak. This was translated by Aaron Schwartzman in the 1932 or 34. Pilniak's a really interesting figure. He's a man after my own heart as someone who, and I'll tell you why in a sec, could not literally write a normal book to save his own life. He came up, really started writing and getting into his groove post-revolution, was sort of seen as a documentarian of the revolution, but in a different way than some of the other writers that were focused more on sort of the urban response to it, like what was happening in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And he really carved out a unique style that I think at one point was even called something translated into English as Pilniakism. He's widely credited as the second most read author in Soviet Union in the 1920s behind Gorky, which is amazing to me given how weird he gets. He eventually runs afoul of the censors. He had always kind of, played around with them a little bit, but I think in the late 1920s, he finally, through, there was one short story that had incestuous themes. I think that was Mahogany is the most common translation of that story. And then Teal, the Unextinguished Moon, which is available as part of a collection. I think it's been published several times, but I think there's an Overlook edition that's the newest. And that story featured a character that was very clearly Stalin, and Stalin in 1926 said something like he's trying to make a fool of us. So he was kind of made to tamp it down a bit, starting in maybe 29 and 30. The censors started getting a look at his stuff a little early. Ivan Moscow was written before that point. 1925. Yep, it's not. I'm going to say 1925. Pretty confident 1925. This takes as a central, this is a great example of his style, where you have a lot of flashbacks, a lot of movement across time and space, a lot of themes kind of jammed together. You have scenes from the Civil War. You have scenes from a sort of high-tech research plant. You have plane rides with some very old-timey and possibly drunk pilots. You have a man who may or may not be trying to make love to a radioactive mummy. He's known for, lyrical turns, asides, things that, sort of insertion of documents into texts. So he's right there in the thick of what I think is happening with modernism, and he's one of my favorite examples of those currents coming out of Russia. Later in his life, basically everyone remembers what he did, and he's given one last chance to redeem himself, where he has to write a socialist realist novel about the recently modernized Soviet meat industry.
Just go
and
away,
he
Georgia. Stop.
serializes this novel called Meat, a novel. And it's getting ready to get published after the serialization, and all of a sudden his book deal gets canceled. And he is thrown into a Russian prison camp after show trial, claiming he was a Japanese spy. May have been. It wouldn't surprise me. He was definitely feeding Andrei Gide some information about what was going on in the Soviet Union, but mostly it was like he failed at writing a serious socialist realist novel about the meat industry. It wasn't even necessarily it was subversive. It was just weird, and they didn't understand it, and they thought he was trying to make a fool of them. That's at least one scholar's interpretation. I'll skip and try to be a little briefer with this one. This is one of our more recent titles. Josef Szczechowicz, the story of the Paper Crown. This was written in Poland in 1923. It is written by an openly gay writer. It has openly homosexual themes, and you can imagine, given that's still a problem in Poland right now, what a feat that was in 1923 in Poland. But this was his first work. I think one of the few sustained longer works of fiction that he wrote. He mostly is best known as a poet. I think he published 7 or 8 books of poems, and then he moved from Lublin to Warsaw for a bit at the beginning of the war, moved back thinking he would be safe, and unfortunately died in a bombing attack on Lublin by the Germans. This was a book we sort of found. Frank Garrett, who translated it, who I've worked with before, he translated Bruno Schultz's Angela. I sort of sent him a link to Szczechowicz, and we started talking about his poetry, and then he went deeper and found this early story that was published in a magazine. It was published anonymously, or at least in that issue. It did not appear with his name on it, though I think there's a subsequent issue where it refers back to him having written this. And it's an incredibly bold book. It's feverish and surreal. There's a lot of wrestling with sort of how one lives an authentic life as a gay man in a Catholic-dominated country, and he's variously going back and forth with St. Francis of Assisi and various fevered dreams, meanwhile also discussing philosophical matters with his friends. It jumps around a lot, and you can see that there's also a theme with Ivan Moscow, but would highly recommend those 2 books. I would love to get more of both of them into print. I see Lisa Hayden is on. Hi, Lisa. If you ever have any interest in Pilniak, you just say the word. He's got some really fun early 20s stuff that I'd love to see. I just couldn't resist while you're here.
Oh no, I'm so glad you mentioned him, because Brad and James know about this. I mentioned it to them over email. I'm starting, or about to start, a series of posts on my blog, which I haven't written pretty much since the war started very regularly. But I decided to write about writers who wrote wafer-thin books, or wafer-thin books by writers who had political problems of various sorts. And I actually put two Pietilä books in my book cart. And one has Ivan Moscow, which I figured would be a good choice because of your publication, because people who read the blog could then read the book. I mean, the Anglophone readers who read the blog could then read your book. Yeah, I love Pietilä, so.
Wonderful. I've got my eye on a book called Machines and Wolves from the mid-20s. So just, make a note.
Okay.
You guys are just seeing book deals happen in real time here. This is what I bring to the proceeding.
And if it helps, as a completely objective person, I can say it's a great book.
It sounds great. Yeah. I think I saw something about it on Twitter some time ago, either from you or Jacob, I think.
Oh yes.
Yes. And I thought, wow, this sounds really good. And I pulled it off the shelf then, and I've got a lot of books in my book cart, and but now it's very imminent.
Wonderful.
So.
And I'll throw out one that I didn't do. You can, if you're interested in all of my Wafer-Thin recommendations, sublimaryeditions.com has the 80 plus I've published. But I wanted to throw out a more modern example. This is The Most Fragile Objects by Alberto Chimal, who's a contemporary Mexican author. This is translated by George Henson, same guy who's been working on Sergio Pital for Deep Vellum. And this is a really tough read. It's a really uncomfortable read. It touches on sort of different 3 stories somewhat intertwined but related, focusing on, we'll call them, very extreme power dynamics. And each story is not quite what it appears, but I've never felt quite as uneasy reading a book, but I think it's uneasy in a rewarding way. So do check it out. This was published by Carcanet Editores, and it's one of the few, if not the only, Ishmaels published in English. Speaking of things I would do if I had an unlimited budget.
I'm impressed by just, I want to say that the number of translations that you managed to put out, considering how, they're not cheap, or they at least, either you're getting great deals on translations or you're taking significant risk, because I would love to do more translation projects on our list, but getting a translator who will work on royalties is not easy.
It's we do it is more the risk thing than otherwise, and it pans out sometimes and not others. But that is the benefit of the Wafer-Thin book is
Yeah.
the train. I don't envy whoever had to convince Deep Vellum's board of directors to pay for Solenoid, but I'm glad. But that's a much harder sell than a 20,000 word novella.
Well, this is one that I'm working on with the translator. This is not what the cover is going to look like, but this is a translation of an Austrian novel from 1909 by a woman named Elsa Jerusalem. It's going to be probably it's going to be probably on the order of 650 to 700 pages long. So it's a beast, but it's a great, it's so, what amazes me about, so I'm working with a woman named Stephanie Ortega, who's a retired professor of German from UT Austin. And the prose is just so un-Germanic in terms of being, it's not, it's not clumpy. It's not, it's very, very light, very streamlined, and she sends me a chapter, and I'm, I think, well, I'm going to just look through a few pages and I'll come back to it, and then 60 pages later, I'm still with it. So, but we were really lucky because she was already working on it, and she agreed to work on a royalty basis. So it was a small miracle.
No kidding. Well, good luck.
Okay, well, let's if anybody else want to jump in and tout a particularly good book that you came across this month. I noticed in the chat a couple of things being mentioned. So Audrey says Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nghi, Story of Love and Solitude by Roger Lewinter, and several of Natalia Ginsburg. Natalia Ginsburg, always reliable for a Wafer-Thin. The Dry Heart, which a lot of folks have read in the last year and early last year. Yeah, that's I've got a couple of Ginsburgs on my list since it's been a long, long time. I think Harcourt Brace, is it Harcourt Brace or Farrar Straus? Somebody did a bunch of hers in the 90s, and then it disappeared, and now she's coming back again from New Directions in the US, at least.
I see Audrey's prompted that we should talk about the book. It's beginning to feel like my usual book club.
Well,
I run a library book club, and we keep this thing running on time. So I always figure we do introductions for about 15 minutes, talk about the book for 30 or 40, and then go back to other stuff. That means everybody gets a chance to speak if they want to. So
right. Okay, so this was one of James's picks, so I'm going to start off by putting it back in his lap. What led you to recommend this book?
Well, I mean, when this first came out, I begged Archipelago for an electronic PDF of it before it came out, because read his other books that are in English. There are only 4 in English. He wrote a lot, but I think there's just the 4 novels and a couple of short stories in English, and I desperately want them to translate the rest, or I'm going to have to learn Dutch, which will not work. But so I knew I needed it before I read a word of it. But it's just, I mean, it's one of the most grippingly bleak and vividly written books, particularly at the length it is. I mean, there's so much in it for it's only 80 pages in this version, and there's just so much in it, but it keeps taking you by surprise, because it seems as though it's almost the material for a dark comedy, but it's not funny. And there's a lot of comedy in some of his other writing, but if there is comedy in this, it's pretty grim. It's just that it's a very different take. I mean, as you said, for the time, it must have been astonishing, and I can see why it made people angry. But just a very different take on the resistance narrative, on the surviving war narrative, on just the idea. There's absolutely nothing heroic in this book at all. Probably the closest someone comes to heroism is a deluded old guy trying to protect some fish, and he ends up in a terrible state. So, but it doesn't feel at all forced or deliberately as though it's trying to shock you either. It just has this calm, downbeat piling on of horror after horror. And it's just completely convincing. I would not say that it's a book you enjoy necessarily, but I've read it twice now, and just gripping and horrible throughout. I couldn't recommend it highly enough. It's quite interesting to see, as I say, the 4 books of his that have come into English. I don't know how representative they are of all the rest, because there's quite a variety of material covered in there, but the ones that have come into English mostly are sort of based around World War II. And he's not at all a comfortable or comforting writer about people's behavior in times of war and under great stress. I mean, just the fact that, this whole thing really is it's a horrible, horrible series of events that start off because a guy just needs a rest. And I loved it.
Well, Gordon, you were familiar with this before it came up on our list, I gather. When had you read it?
This was recent, but I guess I knew it because of looking through Pushkin's list. And there's which James had mentioned, some of the earlier Pushkins I love. There's a Russian writer, Gazdanov, right? Yeah, and James and I have lamented that they changed the covers. But again, it is that darkness of war, almost the futility of it, and the realization that you may not be alive 1 second later. Even that very early on, lying down, having a rest, hoping somebody will give him a drink of water, watching the dogfight and realizing that the spray bullets from the dogfight could end up finishing his life, and he's just lying there doing nothing. And that the bizarre thing of it, working out that it's a spa town, and things about what he said about the house being alive because there's no dust, and there's little observations that he can see that, like an inanimate object has life, as in the house or something like that, but he no longer has a great regard for human life, and it's all about I survive and someone else doesn't, and just finding the way to, I guess, to keep moving his feet forward. And also early on the discussion with the Spanish guy, when just saying, I'm not a communist anymore. again, that futility, that idealism is just dissolved now in battle after drudgery, after just somehow trying to survive. So I agree, yeah, very dark book and different to some other war novels that I've read, and in some cases a little close. And it was strange. It was something I mentioned last month. I reread Black Forest, which is a French writer, and it's all about death. And there were moments when reading them in the same day, there felt like little parallels between the two, that death can be completely random, but in war, that randomness is kind of ramped up to an extreme degree, and you just don't know what's going to happen.
It's funny.
It's also interesting. Oh, sorry.
Ties. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's absolutely, for a book that's written from the, the right side, the winning side, there's absolutely no triumphalism at all. It's just, it's completely, the kind of the strongest emotion he probably has is, the happiness of being able to lie down for a bit and pat a cat. There's kind of nothing more strong that he experiences than that. He doesn't have. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
The Germans show, a couple of people show up and say, "You don't own this house," right?
Yeah.
And like when you read the book, they're doing something very dangerous because they're threatening this guy, right? And he kills them, So he feels strongly about maintaining what he's got, like everybody else. Actually, he's going to survive, And I did find it interesting that there were a couple of references to a German officer would never do this. Right, we're in 1945. I think German officers would do plenty of things. Survival after all this hard war, and then obviously the big shock of the book is when the partisans show up, and in the last 10 pages, and they suddenly take over the house and destroy everything. And as you said, very unromantic, and it's just a very interesting book.
Well, I wonder if part of what's going on, I mean, this is late in the war, and it's also taking place at this territory, which, where actually some of the absolute worst things in the final stage of the war happened. Poles taking vengeance on ethnic Germans, for example, right. Which was, so this territory between where the Russians were, taking control, where the Allies were trying to figure out, well, just how far forward do we go? Also, if this guy, if he's, if we believe he's a Dutch soldier, he's the same. His country's been liberated, so he's got nothing to gain from this situation. So it is, it is that kind of edge situation is in some ways the most chaotic stage, and particularly because, as we now know, there were tremendous, horrifying incidents of people getting theirs back after years. I'm trying to think of there's a German writer who's written a book about something like "Don't say anything about," or "Please promise you'll kill yourself," I think is the title of the book, which records, how many German civilians truly did kill themselves or killed their children and took off, or, things like that, because they were just so sure that the Soviet soldiers were going to be so brutal in their treatment after what Germany did to the areas of the Soviet Union that they occupied. And, the Poles getting back on the Germans, the Czechs getting back on the Germans, different political factions trying to wage to come out on top. There was a lot of backstabbing going on and score settling in this period.
And it's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to say one of the curious things in this book is that he's wearing a Russian uniform. He takes his Russian uniform off and hides it, And then when the colonel comes back at the end, he puts his Russian uniform on. Even though he's referred to as a Dutchman, he's a kind of ambiguous as to where he stands, right?
Well, he's definitely in some sort of irregular unit, because the regular units, the Czechs fought with the Czechs and the Poles fought with the Poles, etc. So they, even if it was just a company, they kind of stayed, at least the Ally side, organized. This is clearly a hodgepodge that's kind of probably, again, as territory gets taken, units fall apart, people are wandering around, and they meet up and, okay, let's fight together. It's very ad hoc, and to even argue that they were on a side.
Mm-hmm.
It is like that, because there's absolutely, for a, I guess, a war novel, there's absolutely no sense of any kind of discipline or organization. I mean, he wanders off at the start. He doesn't remember or know what his orders were. He meets a couple of people he's fought with, but he doesn't, really understand what they're saying. He vanishes for weeks, and then at the end he just comes back and says, "Oh yeah, I was a prisoner."
Reinterprets his orders from his sergeant into things that are more favorable to what he would do.
Exactly.
My
Yeah.
sergeant, I'm sure my sergeant said to check out this house and see if anybody's
Yeah,
in
and how
there.
why?
That has never happened in the military. No, that never.
Well, they were described as partisans, weren't they? I think that was used.
At the end, they're described as partisans. At the beginning, it's more like an irregular unit that's fighting along with the Allies.
Did the Soviets have those units because that was still the period of the idealism of communism? The Spanish guy talks about fighting for the communists in Spain, and then now he's fighting for Russia. And I meant to look that up as to whether they were part of history but not spoken about a great deal, because obviously
by that stage of the game, I mean, this is where Stalin and the Soviets had a long game that they were playing all along, and that long game was, they didn't want any idealistic communists. They wanted to get rid of them all. They wanted functionaries who would follow orders from Moscow. They wanted to loot every factory that they could to reindustrialize their own shattered infrastructure. They liked partisans when the Germans were on Russian soil, but the minute they got out of Russia and started to move into Eastern Europe, they were uncontrollable, unpredictable factions, and they wanted to get rid of them wherever they could.
It's also interesting because, particularly as the book goes on, it starts off with this, the central character seeking comfort and enjoying some luxuries after deprivation for so long. But then, as the other partisans turn up, they're all presumably people who've been living, with great deprivation. They've all been living in horrible conditions. But just the impulse, this complete, orgy, not just of violence towards people, to murder the people who are in the house, but just destroy everything in the house. I mean, he ends up chucking a grenade into the house and finishing it off at the end. Even these people who've been deprived of everything for so long, rather than stop and enjoy any of it, to sit down, drink the expensive wine, eat the nice food, sleep in the nice bed, it's just rip it to shreds, burn everything, kill everything, level everything. It's quite bizarre, but again, completely convincing as to why people are behaving like that.
Yeah, I first read this book right after it came out, and I just reread it now. And I'll tell you, I read it very differently now when I'm just finishing up a book about the war in Ukraine, because that ending reminds me so much of the pictures of the destruction in Ukraine, what Russia has done to, apartment buildings, taking people's belongings, destroying their houses. It reminds me so much of that because of the utter chaos.
Just do all of that and then just shove a Russian flag on top of the rubble, and it's just crazy.
Yeah.
And then the weird thing about the ending few sentences, going back to sort of the title, which was The Untouched House, which it was untouched when he got there. It was there was soup boiling on the stove. It was just, you know, one of those people left 5 minutes before, or the feeling that they had. And then the last sentence or so, he's chucked a grenade, it's destroyed it, and then he sort of blames the house for being unreal and being like a false kind of thing. What he's imbued it first, he imbued it the way he did, and we saw it through his eyes, and at the end he's blaming it for what it's not, which I just thought was a very good way to circle back to the title, all the feel of what that was. If anybody's got that, they can read the last sentence or two. I just thought that was great.
Yes,
I don't know if it's connected, but I did a little research into the Dutch title, the Behouden House, and apparently there was a Dutch settlement in North America, Newfoundland or someplace like that. Anyway, they constructed a large kind of communal house where the colony lived through the winter, and then left it. And I guess they found it years and years later in essentially untouched condition. And so in Dutch history books, you'll see it referred to as the Behouden House, which means the untouched house. So I just wondered if he had any, I mean, if that title he was reaching from something he might have heard about as a school kid.
The unreality too of the house in the end. I mean, there's a bit earlier on where I think he's just sitting there and he's looking at everything around him, and he's sort of talking as though, you know, literally none of it is real. It's all just, you know, things firing off in his brain that are giving him this sense that he's a person with other people around him in a concrete place, but it might as well just be, you know, random static hitting his senses from the outside universe. You know, none of it, you know, he's just imagining it all from randomness. It's quite, yeah.
Well, you know, I probably went for about 30 pages assuming that he had actually been killed, and this was his
Right.
So Ambrose Bierce
afterlife.
Yes, it felt like occurrence of Owl Creek Bridge. I was sure we were heading there, and then I
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, like, you know, I think 1951 was a very good year to write about the pretensions of culture. You know, I think this World War II, with the most cultivated country in the world, Germany, committing these atrocities, and the word coming out about these atrocities. He was presumably a soldier, this writer. So maybe he was thinking more about the worm's eye view of just being a soldier and not so much the Holocaust and things like this. But, like, you know, the brutality, all of these nice food and bed and things like this just cover up the brutality of human beings, I think. And World War II exposes this in a unique way, you know? And so, I don't know, that's pretty interesting. He's angry at the end, you know, like.
Well, I think World War II, I mean, first of all, we're still, this is, again, it's sort of the contrast between, you know, countries that went through occupation. I mean, France is probably the most extreme example of collaboration and resistance, and the fact that, you know, the lines were extremely blurry. But you know, I think number one, we have a presumption that this sort of thing didn't happen in previous wars.
Right.
Which, of course,
World War I occupies the place of the war that ended all of the illusions, right? You know, that was the one that shattered all of the finery of the class system and all this stuff. But World War II, it's kind of a double whammy. He's looking at it as World War II as having done that. I don't know. I agree with you, Brad, that the Americans don't have a good perspective on this, because they look at everything pretty black and white because they're not as involved in the.
Well, we didn't get our feet dirty. We didn't, you know, we didn't have a Gestapo station in our time. I mean, my landlord in Belgium was old enough that he remembered his town. I mean, he lived across the street from the house that he was born in, and he had built a house on the piece of land that his grandparents had lived in. And he said he remembered when the little Gemeentehuis, which was the little commune house in the main street, which is like 3 blocks from our house, that was a Gestapo station, that was, and, he said, yeah, people collaborated.
Well, I mean, America too is the country that invented the concept of premature anti-fascism. It's okay to be anti-fascist, but only once we've reached a certain point.
Only they really get bad. Well,
Yeah,
Ben,
exactly.
Ben O'Connell, can I ask, since you kind of decided to join because the book struck you, what were your feelings about it?
Oh, I loved it. I read it 2 or 3 years ago. I can't quite remember when. Based on a recommendation, I think from Graham Presser, and it. Sorry, one of my dogs is going nuts. When I first started it, I really, James, like you said, I thought it was going to be a kind of a Heller-like Catch-22 black comedy, and honestly, it felt that way even through the beginning of the Germans' arrival at the house. So it continuously surprised me throughout. And I don't know that I would say much beyond what I'd be repeating what others have said about the kind of the nihilism of uh, the novel's outlook. But I was particularly struck by the German officer who makes a point of shaving every day, keeping order in a world that has gone insane. It's the thing that he can control, and his apologies after the soldiers break into the cellar. It wasn't only the actions of the partisans that I imagine would have roiled people in 1951, but I suspect that character in 1951 would have struck a lot of Belgians as just horrifying. I mean, the enemy, the guys that were kind of the monsters are demonstrated as something less than monstrous.
Well, I think one thing that it is not, just as an example, Belgium has a wonderful, I mean, it's a terrible phrase, adjective to use, but they have a very moving Holocaust museum in the town of Mechelen, which was basically the logistical center where they gathered the Jews and put them on the trains to Auschwitz. And one of the fascinating things about that is, first of all, when the Germans rounded up Jews, when they picked a quarter to go in and collect the Jews from, they were normally doing it side by side with the local police.
Right.
The local police were totally working on their side. And so I mean, that's just what I found fascinating about it is in documenting this kind of collaboration in the museum, they also have accounts where they have, for example, a policeman in Antwerp who said, "I'm not going to do this. I'm quitting as a policeman because I refuse to put people on trucks that are going to be taken off to a death camp. And I don't want to be in this uniform anymore." So there were people, and there were actually relatively few collections of Jews in Brussels because the mayor of Brussels said, "I'm not having any of my people support this." And so the kind of nuances, it wasn't a case of the Germans came in and they did everything and everybody bent over backwards to cooperate or just were uninvolved. There was give and take in both directions going on to an extent that I don't think we get a sense of outside the countries where these things were actually going on.
It's interesting too. I'd like to know, because I mean, you look at French literature of the time, there was a lot of resistance and, you know, war literature being published through the war, even in occupied France. There was quite a thriving publishing industry. I don't know what the case was in the Netherlands. I assume it was much less so, but just because there was less of an attempt by the occupiers to pretend that everything's normal. But yes, I mean, these books like this, which, yeah, I mean, I guess 6 years after the war is a bit of time. But another one that reminded me of another Dutch book, Hans Kielson's Comedy in a Minor Key, which only came out a couple of years after the war. It's a similarly short book. It's only 100 pages. But it reminded me, I was reminded of this reading An Untouched House, right? Because again, it's a book that seems as though it's going to be a sort of a dark comedy about the war in the Netherlands. It's about a couple who are sheltering a Jewish man in their house and hiding him from the Gestapo. And, you know, that is relatively difficult, but they've got a fairly normal life that they've worked out doing this. But then the man dies. And the problem is that it's much harder than to dispose of this poor dead guy, because that's what's going to bring, even though he's no longer around, that's what's going to bring, hell down upon them. So it's the plot almost has a kind of Weekend at Bernie's type vibe to it, but it's again a completely, straight-faced, dark book, and a very, very good one. So yeah, I was reminded of that by An Untouched House, because again, it's the elements are there for some sort of horrible comedy, but yes, it's a much more horrifying thing in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. So next month we've got Palimpsest by Alexander Lund from Poland. James, this was your pick. Do you want to take us out with a quick snapshot of what we've got to look forward to?
Well, unlike the last two books, particularly this one, it's a lot. It is a fun book. It's a lot more fun. It's a playful, fun, rambling, but still short book. So no need to slit our wrists after
The schedule
next
says
month.
something else. The schedule says endless summer.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. So you were right.
That's also a fun and lovely book. That's a very light-hearted, warm. Yeah, the title is not a misleading one. So again,
It's
no
a terrible. Am I wrong, or is that a terrible, terrible cover for that book?
Is that the one with the horses on it? I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
A brownish horse with a grayish.
Yep. I can't show it to you because I'm looking at it in the browser, but
Yeah. I mean, I remember picking it up thinking, oh, this is not going to be fun, and then actually, I did 10 pages. I set it aside, but I said, oh, wow, this is not what I expected when I picked this book up. So that's good to know. It's good to know.
It is a lovely book, but my one bit of advice is, if you want to appreciate to its maximum, don't look up about the author, because they have done some fairly dodgy things. Let's just say blackface features amongst other things. So yeah, best just leave the author alone and just read the book.
Well, that's a fine, blackface is a fine Dutch tradition.
But in this case, I think it's a Norwegian. I think. Yeah.
Okay. Any last comments or questions that folks have? Thank you all for joining. Hopefully this has been a fun out there. Several ways. That's a great way of putting it. Thank you for that, Audrey. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, thanks for joining us. Thank you, Josh, for coming in. And I know I wrote down, I will put all the lists of the titles in the comments on the video, all the titles that have been mentioned, and I'm looking forward to some good reading. As I said, I am finding that after years and years of trying to focus on out-of-print books, it's nice to be able to reach and pick up something that's current-ish. I mean, this is current in the sense that it's in print, and realize I'm not diverting myself from my grand project here. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Have a good rest of the day, and we will see you in March.
Thanks.
Take care.
Hey,
Bye.
See ya.
bye.